spiders, snakes, worms, bats and more. We are not making a video about animals. These are just a few of the interesting creatures that the Chinese eat quite normally. Chinese cuisine, which is considered to be the richest in the world, can really combine unimaginable things into a meal. Why is it that there is nothing left to eat properly and these guys eat whatever they can find? Actually, there is a much deeper and bitter reason behind this. I think many other cultures have no way of understanding this because none of us have ever had to eat our dead family. Welcome to the Hidden Truths YouTube channel. It's the late 17th century and the world population is about 500 million. And do you know what the estimated population of China was in the same period? About 130 million. In short, if you look at any period in human history, you'll see that China has always had a much larger population than other countries, even in spite of the massive massacres it has suffered. We don't know exactly why this happened, but of course we can make some guesses. China is one of the largest countries in the world, and it is a country with extremely fertile land. And thanks to the diversity of climate, agriculture has always played a very important role. And with this abundance, food production and population growth have always been higher than in its neighbors. But even though a large population provides many advantages, it has also always been a threat to the country. The population, which is a giant power if managed well, is a risk that can self-destruct at the slightest break. So how did the Chinese manage this huge population successfully for thousands of years? The answer is simple: with food and an iron fist. In harsh authoritarian systems, peasants in particular are seen as robots, and in Chinese history we see how this was sometimes dictated by imposing production quotas on peasants. In Chinese history, villages were subjected to such quotas, and if they could not meet the production demanded by the state, they were either punished or their rations were reduced. Of course, this meant that many of them died, so the peasants had to work frantically just to survive. This kind of rule has been a force over the Chinese people for ages, forcing them to work and obey by threatening to starve them. Now, you may ask why these people did not rebel against such oppressive rule. This is extremely interesting. When we look at Chinese history, yes, we see some rebellions, but they were very shallow compared to the revolutionary uprisings of other countries. And the harsh pressure on the peasants has always existed. There is also an interesting claim about this issue of rebellion. Although this is a theory that has not been scientifically proven, some researchers argue that there is a relationship between the diet of societies and their susceptibility to rebellion and war. For example, it is argued that societies with a diet based on red meat are more warlike and aggressive, while there are some claims that agricultural societies where access to red meat is difficult and where people eat more vegetables and legumes have less desire for war and rebellion and are more obedient. But as I said, this is not scientifically proven, but if we look at history, it makes some sense. So how can we relate all this to today? Thousands of years have passed. Techniques have improved. Food production efficiency has increased. Why do the Chinese still eat as if they are still suffering from famine? Some of you may say, what hunger is this? Here we come to an event that destroyed the psychology of the Chinese people and, in my opinion, all sense of ethics and empathy. The Great Mao Famine. Mao Zedong is one of the most egotistical people in history and a great example of what can happen when you give an egotistical maniac great powers. He rose to political power as leader of the communist forces during the Chinese Civil War in 1921. And then, after the communists won the war in 1949, he founded the People's Republic of China and ruled the country until his death in 1976. In 1958, Mao launched what became known as the Great Leap Forward. The aim was to abandon the old culture and create a new industrialized China. Of course, outsiders might say, isn't this a good thing? But the reality is not like that. For this obsessive obsession, Mao built industrial cities and created communes. The people who worked in these communes lived in state-controlled factories, and their lives consisted of working there. They were paid with enough food to keep them alive. Those who did not want to work took their place in cemetery. Of course, in order to pay this labor force with food, similar slave agricultural communes were set up and unthinkable production quotas were imposed. Mao wanted the people to concentrate on only two things: industrial production and food production. In 1976, in order to erase everything else from the memory of the people, he launched a movement called the Cultural Revolution, which aimed to completely sever the ties of the Chinese people with their past. We're talking about one of the oldest and most important ancient civilizations in the world, an extremely important historical civilization that shaped history with its inventions. But one of their own came out and aimed to erase this memory under the guise of modernization. So how did Mao realize this idea? From those who made handicrafts from the old culture, to almost everyone who kept any historical book, any item, even the slightest material from those times in their homes, he sent them to concentration camps and destroyed them by working them to death. Craftsmen had their hands cut off, and Confucianists or people of any faith were killed. During this period, all temples of ancient Chinese philosophy were attacked, and many were destroyed and ancient texts burned. Can you imagine an operation against people's past, their beliefs and values, their identity? And the Chinese are doing it to the Chinese. Unimaginable production quotas, pressure on people, destruction day by day. But all this drama does not cause the Chinese people to lose patience and raise the flag of rebellion. Remember, Chinese society does not like to rebel. That is why the final straw came not from the people's revolt, but from a very different place, from the sparrows. The year was 1958, when Mao considered himself a deity. Of course, a simple observation caught the attention of this ignorant megalomaniac and his entourage. They see small sparrows eating the grain spilled on the ground, and they make a very simple deduction. Sparrows are eating grain. So these sparrows will also eat the grain in the field, and we will not be able to achieve the desired production efficiency. The order, known as the Mao birds, was sent all over the country, saying that all the sparrows in the country should be hunted and killed. Nothing more stupid could happen, right? But it did, and indeed the Chinese people, now turned into robots, did it with great enthusiasm. Tens of millions of birds were slaughtered, and it was celebrated as a great success. But this inhuman slaughter would have a horrifying consequence in the years that followed. In the harvest following the slaughter of the birds, there is said to be some increase in production, but only a small amount. Of course, Mao and his cabinet thought that this would lead to a further increase in the future, but a different problem began to arise. In fact, something that seems to be straight out of the stories told in the Bible and the Torah begins to happen. An endless invasion of locusts and insects. Since birds, the natural predators of insects, have been wiped out across the country, pests have multiplied abnormally. Of course, the rats that feed on them also invade the country. The devastation is unimaginable. From the crops in the fields to the produce in the warehouses, insects and rats attack and consume everything. China rushes to import millions of sparrows from neighboring Russia, but it was too late. The agricultural production system has collapsed. The disintegration of the food chain began to hit millions of industrial workers like a tsunami. And this chain of events made life a living hell in China, a country of about 800 million people at the time. As the food crisis deepened, Mao's government began to discard rural people. In order to keep the industry going, the export of basic food, especially from Russia, peaked. But this food was brought in mainly to maintain order in the cities. Look, unfortunately, contrary to popular belief, states and governments do not care about protecting their people. Their concern is their own ideals and their own love of seats, and in difficult times the people are the first to be sacrificed. Especially low-income people are the first to be sacrificed. Remember this saying, one day in the future you will be sadly invested. So the Chinese government singled out the communes in the villages that failed to meet their production quotas as the first class to be discarded and stopped food aid to them almost completely. Of course, what happened next was horrible. People ate and consumed everything living in the area before starvation. Over time, animal husbandry and wildlife in these regions collapses. By the way, don't think of this consumption as normal hunting, cooking and eating. We're not talking about 3 or 5 people, we're talking about millions of people fighting for survival. According to later testimonies of people who survived the famine, when the devastation of the 3 years of horror was at its peak, people would find any living thing they saw in nature and they would tear it apart and eat it raw like wild animals, because there was no time to clean and cook it. Such a waste of time meant that others would see the prey and steal it from you, the survivors explain. And what do you think happened when the animals ran out? People started to eat insects, grass, weeds, bark, and even mud. A villager who survived this period said, "I was a little girl at the time. Our village had long since run out of food, and I was so weak that I could count every bone in my body. I didn't even have the strength to stand up. It had been a few months since I lost my father to starvation. When he lost consciousness and collapsed, people in our village cut him up, boiled him, and ate him. We had gotten used to this scene because it had happened many times before. We had to eat dead people to survive, and when there was no food left, people ate the dead in the grave. When my mother could no longer fight hunger, she closed the door to our house, sat me in front of her, and put a knife next to me. She said to me, 'Daughter, when I die, I want you to eat me before the others come. Eat as much as you can.' I couldn't even listen to him because I was crying, and really soon he collapsed and died on the floor. It took me a while to realize this truth, but I knew that people would come to our door, so I tore off pieces of my mother's exposed legs and ate as much as I could. After a while, the neighbors who couldn't see her broke down our door and came in and tore her up and ate her in front of my eyes. It was not only our families that Mao took from us, he also took our humanity from us. The details of many more similar events are written in detail by Yang Jisheng in his book The Great Chinese Famine, which you can obtain and read if you wish. Animals, grasses, insects, mud, and dead people are all consumed in turn, leaving no one to eat and nothing for them to eat. During this Great Famine, which lasted 3 years, more than 60 million people are thought to have died, according to current estimates. This figure does not even include those who died in labor camps or were slaughtered during the Cultural Revolution. In the following years, the question of famine was solved with the rebalancing of the ecology by sparrows and imports. Now, some of you may be wondering how the people kept Mao in power after these events, but you will be surprised. Mao remained in power with all his might until he died of natural causes at the age of 82. Even his political party did not collapse after that. Even today, the political organization he founded is still ruling China. The mentality is always the same. I think you have the answer to the question, why do the Chinese eat everything? Imagine people who survived by eating mud in those years raise their children to see everything as food. This trauma doesn't go away in a few generations, and it hasn't gone away yet. In China today, the consumption of insects, cats, dogs, exotic animals is becoming less and less. But while a large population may seem like a strength for a country, it is actually a ticking time bomb, and time is running out for China. Since 2020, China's food production has been unable to keep up with food demand due to changing climatic conditions and excessive demand, especially in 2022 and 2023. Huge water shortages led to a drastic reduction in agricultural yields. According to a report published this year, the drought of the last 2 years is expected to indirectly affect 900 million people in the coming years. Considering that the country's population is 1.4 billion, this is a very, very serious figure. So will China be able to overcome this problem? I don't think so, because the drought in 2022 alone will affect 2.2 million hectares of land in China's agricultural regions. If you look at these figures, you can better understand how big the loss is. That's just a few regions affected, not even all of them. China has once again brought this problem upon itself. Yes, maybe this time they didn't kill the sparrows, but they had a crazy industrial growth. And as a result, the rivers have dried up or become severely polluted, and that water can no longer be used for agriculture. There is always a balance in nature, and if you disturb it, you will experience the consequences. So I wonder, what do you think the outcome will be this time? What will those 900 million affected people do in the coming years as the climate deteriorates further and droughts become more severe? As I said before, we have learned one of the answers to why the Chinese consider everything as food. Of course, there are historical and cultural reasons, but this great famine is the biggest reason. But the question is, as the next famine is coming to China's doorstep, what or who else will these people look at as food? Thank you for watching the video. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video for more content. Take care until we see you in the next video.